I woke up to an unusual sound, splashing water. At first I thought I was dreaming, but as my mind cleared, I realized it was real. My heart pounded. Who the hell was in my pool this early in the morning? I groggily pulled back the curtain, expecting to see my kids playing, maybe my wife taking an early morning dip, but what I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't my family. It wasn't anyone I recognized. A full-blown swimming class was taking place in my backyard. At least a dozen kids were jumping in and out of my pool, kicking water everywhere, completely oblivious to the fact that they were trespassing. My lounge chairs were occupied by parents sipping coffee like they were at a resort, and standing at the edge of the pool, barking orders like a self-important drill sergeant, was Karen. Karen, my entitled nightmare of a neighbor. The same woman who had spent months making my life miserable with petty HOA complaints, who once threatened to fine me because my mailbox was a shade too dark for her liking, who complained that my porch lights were too bright even though they were HOA approved, and now she was running an unauthorized swim school in my backyard. For a moment I was too stunned to react. Karen was dressed in an expensive designer swimsuit, sunglasses perched arrogantly on her nose, a whistle hanging from her neck. She clapped her hands, calling out instructions to the kids as if she owned the place. One boy flailed in the water, struggling to stay afloat, and Karen, completely at ease in my space, shouted, "Keep your legs straight! That's it, use your arms! No slacking!" I sniffed. I stormed out the back door, my footsteps heavy against the pavement, but Karen didn't even flinch. If she noticed me at all, she didn't care. She continued shouting commands, gesturing for the kids to keep swimming. It wasn't until I was practically in her face that she finally turned, lifting her sunglasses just enough to glance at me, her expression bored, as if I was an inconvenience rather than the rightful owner of the pool she had invaded. "Oh, it's you," she said lazily, lowering her sunglasses again. I clenched my fists. What the hell is going on here? Karen sighed, exasperated like a teacher dealing with an unruly student. "What does it look like?" she said, waving a hand toward the water. "I'm holding my swim class." I stared at her, waiting for her to realize how insane that sounded, but she didn't. "In my pool?" My voice was rising, barely controlled. She rolled her eyes, completely unfazed. "It's a neighborhood pool," she said matter-of-factly. I blinked. "No, it's not. It's mine. On my property." Another dramatic sigh. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just a pool. It's not like you use it all the time, and besides, these kids need a safe place to learn how to swim. I'm providing a service to the community." I looked around, noticing for the first time how many people were in my yard without permission. At least a dozen kids splashed in the pool, their parents lounging in my chairs, acting like they had paid for a membership at some fancy country club. One mom even had the audacity to set up a cooler of drinks on my patio table. That was it. "Get out, all of you." A few parents shifted uncomfortably, their guilt obvious. One mom quickly gathered her kid and started to leave, but most of them hesitated, looking at Karen for guidance, as if she was the one in charge here. Karen folded her arms. "You're being incredibly selfish," she said in a condescending tone. "I spoke with the HOA and they agreed that shared resources should be used for the benefit of the community." My jaw clenched. "This is not a shared resource, this is private property." Karen smiled, smug and victorious, as she reached into her bag and pulled out a document. "I figured you'd say that," she said, handing me a piece of paper with a dramatic flourish. I snatched it and skimmed through it, my pulse pounding. It was an HOA document, but as I read, I realized it had absolutely nothing to do with my pool. It was some generic guideline about community spaces, referring to the neighborhood clubhouse, the tennis courts, and the park, all places that actually belonged to the HOA, not my backyard. "This doesn't mean anything," I snapped, tossing the paper back at her. Karen clicked her tongue, shaking her head like she was disappointed in me. "I knew you'd be difficult about this." Then she turned to the gathered parents, gesturing toward me. "See, this is exactly why we need to make sure everyone understands the rules. Some people just don't know how to share." A few parents looked uncertain now, clearly realizing that Karen was full of it. One mom grabbed her child's towel and hurried off, but most of them still lingered, waiting to see what would happen next. Fine, if they wanted to play dumb, I would force them to leave. I pulled out my phone and unlocked the camera, raising it toward the pool. "All right then, since you have nothing to hide, I'll just record this. For documentation purposes." For the first time, Karen's smirk faltered. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," she said, waving her hand dismissively. I kept the camera rolling, so just to clarify, you're admitting that you're using my pool without permission? That you invited all these people onto my private property without my consent? Karen hesitated. A few parents started shifting, clearly realizing this was not a good look. They had been fine when it was just a neighborhood dispute, but now that everything was being recorded, some weren't so sure. One of the kids shivered, hugging their arms. "Miss Karen, it's kind of cold," she said. Karen forced a smile, her tone suddenly less confident. "All right, class dismissed for today," she said quickly, waving her hand. "We'll continue tomorrow." I took a step forward. "No, you won't." She turned to me, her smugness returning. "Oh, I absolutely will," she said, tilting her head like she was daring me to stop her, "unless you want to deal with some hefty HOA fines for denying access to a community resource." I clenched my fists, watching as she strutted off, the remaining kids and parents gathering their things. Some apologized as they left. But Karen? She didn't care. As she walked away, she tossed one last remark over her shoulder. "See you tomorrow." I stood there, seething, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, I sat in my living room, fists clenched, going over every possible way to shut Karen down. The usual methods wouldn't work. The police wouldn't take it seriously. The HOA was clearly on her side. If I tried to argue, they twisted to make me the villain. No, I needed something different, something that would make it crystal clear that my pool was not public property. And then it hit me. A slow grin spread across my face as the perfect plan formed in my mind. If Karen wanted to use my pool so badly, I was going to let her. Just not in the way she expected. The next morning I made a few calls. After about an hour of searching, I found exactly what I needed, a local ice distributor that specialized in massive bulk deliveries. It took some convincing, but after a bit of negotiating and a hefty payment, they agreed to drop off multiple truckloads of industrial-grade ice blocks later that evening. I could hardly contain my excitement. As the sun began to set, I stood in my backyard watching as the trucks arrived one by one. The workers looked at me like I was insane, but I didn't care. They dumped thousands of pounds of ice directly into the pool, and within minutes, the water began to chill. Fog rolled off the surface as the temperature plummeted. By the time we were done, my pool looked like the Arctic, a shimmering sheet of ice-cold water, chunks of solid ice bobbing on the surface. I stood back, admiring my work. It was perfect. The cameras were set, the trap was in place, now all I had to do was wait. Right on schedule, at precisely 9 a.m. the next morning, Karen strutted into my backyard like she owned the place. A whistle dangled around her neck as she clapped her hands, signaling the kids to get ready. Parents settled into my lounge chairs, completely ignoring the massive no trespassing signs I had put up overnight. It was infuriating they were so confident, so entitled, that they didn't even pause to consider that they might be unwelcome. And then the first kid jumped in. The second his body hit the ice-cold water, he let out a scream so loud that the entire neighborhood must have heard it. His arms flailed wildly, his face twisting in shock as he scrambled to get out. Another kid, already mid-jump, hit the water right behind him and immediately shrieked, thrashing desperately toward the edge. A chain reaction began. Every single kid who had jumped in began screaming. Parents jumped out of their seats, their laughter and small talk instantly turning to panic. Some rushed toward the pool, frantically pulling their kids out as they trembled, their lips turning blue from the shock. It was chaos. Karen, clearly confused, stormed to the edge of the pool, frowning. "What is going on? Why is everyone acting like—" She stopped mid-sentence as she noticed the thick chunks of ice floating on the water. Her eyes narrowed, her expression shifting from confusion to outrage. I stood on my porch, sipping my coffee, watching it all unfold with pure satisfaction. Karen spun toward me, her face red with anger. "What the hell did you do to the pool?" she demanded. I raised an eyebrow, pretending to be surprised. "What do you mean?" She stomped forward. "Why is it freezing? Did you do this on purpose?" I shrugged, taking another sip of coffee. "It's my pool. I decided to cool it down a bit, for maintenance, water purification and all that." Karen clenched her fists, her whole body trembling, not from the cold, but from sheer rage. "You think you're funny." I tilted my head. "Not at all. I just figured since my pool is apparently a public space now, I should take better care of it. Ice baths are great for muscle recovery, by the way. Feel free to jump in." Her nostrils flared. "This is sabotage," she hissed. "You did this just to ruin my swim class." I feigned innocence. "Ruin it, Karen? I'm offering a new experience, a polar plunge. People pay good money for this kind of thing." At that moment, one of the parents, still holding their shivering child, turned to Karen with a look of betrayal. "Wait a second," the woman said, adjusting the towel around her son. "You told us this was a community pool." Another father, looking equally pissed, crossed his arms. Yeah, why would he be allowed to do this if the HOA... Karen froze, realizing too late that she had backed herself into a corner. She forced a laugh, though it came out strained. Well, technically nothing, the mother snapped. You lied to us. The murmurs started spreading. Parents whispered to each other, eyes darting toward Karen, then toward me. The realization hit them all at once. They had been scammed. Karen's confidence wavered. She glanced around, searching for someone to back her up, but no one came to her defense. I leaned against my porch railing, enjoying every second. Karen, if you and your students want to keep using my pool, I'd be happy to let you on one condition. She crossed her arms, glowering at me. What? I smirked. You all have to sign waivers acknowledging that you're using the pool at your own risk. Wouldn't want any liability issues if someone, say, gets hypothermia. Karen's jaw dropped open in fury. Parents began grabbing their things, muttering to each other as they walked out. The same people who had been blindly following Karen's lead just minutes ago were now actively avoiding her. The best part? As they left, some of them actually apologized to me. Karen stood there alone, her hands balled into fists, watching her swim class fall apart before her eyes. She turned back to me, her voice shaking with anger. You think you won? I smiled. I don't think. Karen. I know. She let out a sharp breath, spun on her heel, and stormed off, her whistle swinging wildly around her neck. I watched as the last of the parents disappeared down the street, then turned back to my pool. Chunks of ice still floated on the surface, the water an uninviting, frigid blue. It was over. The ice plan had worked better than I could have imagined. Not only had I completely shut down her ridiculous swim school, but I had also exposed her lies to the very people she had manipulated. But I knew Karen. She wasn't the type to accept defeat. No, she would double down, try to retaliate. And that was fine, because I was just getting started. The morning after Karen's humiliating defeat, I expected peace, but instead I found an official-looking letter from the HOA stuffed into my mailbox. Even before I opened it, I knew exactly what it was. The envelope had that same smug, self-important energy Karen carried herself with, the kind that screamed, "You thought you won? Think again." I tore it open and read. It was a formal notice from the HOA citing me for creating a disturbance and rendering a shared neighborhood resource unusable, a thinly veiled excuse to punish me for turning my own pool into an ice bath. But, the kicker, they were fining me, a hefty sum for violating community guidelines by allegedly restricting access to a public amenity. I let out a slow, humorless laugh. So this was Karen's next move. She couldn't win with logic or convince the neighborhood to keep siding with her, so now she was using the HOA to fight her battles. It wasn't surprising. I had known from the moment she smugly declared she had connections that she would play this card. The problem was, I wasn't dealing with a fair system. The HOA was corrupt, and this letter proved it. Fine, if they wanted to fight, I was more than ready. Instead of responding to the notice, I drove straight to the HOA office. I expected the usual condescending treatment, but even I wasn't prepared for just how deep the corruption ran. The HOA president, an aging, balding man with a permanent scowl, barely looked up when I walked in. "Ah," he said, shuffling papers. "You must be here about the pool situation." I folded my arms. "Yeah, I want to know why one of my neighbors thinks she has the right to run a business in my backyard, and why you're fining me instead of addressing that problem." He let out a long, exaggerated sigh, like I was some annoying customer wasting his time. "Well, according to our guidelines, all shared amenities should be accessible for neighborhood use." I narrowed my eyes. "My pool isn't a shared amenity." He gave me a patronizing smile. "That's where we disagree." I clenched my jaw. "No, that's where facts disagree with you. My pool is inside my property line. I pay for its maintenance. I pay the water bill. It is not part of any HOA-managed space." He shrugged, completely unbothered. "The way we see it, a pool of that size benefits the neighborhood, and it would be unfair to deny others the chance to use it." My fingers curled into fists. "So let me get this straight. I paid for my pool. I maintain my pool, but because it exists, you think it's no longer mine?" "That's exactly right." I took a deep breath, trying not to explode. "And what about Karen? She's not just using my pool, she's profiting from it. She's running a business in my backyard." He waved a dismissive hand. "Karen is providing a valuable service to the community. Parents trust her to teach their kids to swim. It's a win-win situation. I stared at him, realization dawning. They weren't just ignoring the rules, they were making new ones to benefit themselves. Karen wasn't just some entitled neighbor. She had connections. Fine, time to hit back. I left the HOA office with a new plan. I wasn't going to argue with them anymore. I was going to tear them apart. For the next few days, I did nothing but dig into the HOA's history. At first, it seemed like standard community regulations, lawn maintenance, parking rules, trash collection. But then I started finding patterns. Karen had multiple violations waived, everything from improper construction to landscaping that should have been fined. Meanwhile, other homeowners were getting fined for ridiculous things like using the wrong shade of paint for their fences. And then I found the real bombshell. Last year, Karen had requested permission from the HOA to build a pool in her backyard, and they denied her. The reason? Community aesthetic standards. Everything clicked into place. Karen had wanted a pool but couldn't get one, so she manipulated the HOA into letting her take mine instead, and they let her do it either because she bribed them, had dirt on them, or made them believe they'd benefit from backing her. That was all I needed. I compiled everything, emails, documents, records of selective fines, even copies of the community guidelines proving they were violating their own rules. Then I sent it all out. I sent it to a lawyer to begin drafting legal action. I sent it to local news stations to expose corruption. And most importantly, I sent it to the entire neighborhood. Within hours, the emails started rolling in. Other homeowners, ones who had been screwed over by the HOA, were furious. People who had been fined for minor infractions suddenly realized that Karen had been getting away with far worse for years. And then came the emergency HOA meeting. The community center was packed. I had never seen this many people show up before. Karen sat in the front, her usual smugness in place, but there was a tension in her shoulders. She could feel it. Do they comprehend this? The HOA president banged his gavel. We're here to discuss recent complaints regarding... I stood up. No, we're here to discuss corruption. A murmur spread through the room. I walked to the front, dropping a thick folder of evidence onto the table. For years, the HOA has been selectively enforcing rules to benefit a few people while screwing over the rest of us. Karen has been given special treatment. She's been allowed to violate rules, run a business in my backyard, and now you're trying to fine me for defending my own property. Karen's smirk vanished. I passed out copies of the documents. One by one, homeowners began flipping through proof of fines, dismissed violations, and Karen's denied pool request. Then, the final blow. And let's not forget the biggest part of this. I turned toward the crowd. Karen wanted a pool. She applied for one. She got denied. And then suddenly, the HOA decided that my pool was a community resource. Gasps, angry whispers. Karen's face turned white. A man in the back, one of the older residents, shook his head. You mean to tell me this entire fight has been because she couldn't get her own damn pool? Karen stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous, she snapped. He's lying. He's twisting things. Enough, someone cut in. The HOA president looked nervous, sweating. He could feel the entire room turning against him. Another homeowner spoke up. We need a vote, right now. A recall of the entire HOA board? Loud cheers erupted. Karen's mouth opened and closed, searching for something, anything to turn the tide. But it was too late. The HOA was finished. And so was Karen. The moment the motion for a recall was proposed, the room erupted into a storm of voices. Homeowners who had spent years quietly suffering under the HOA's selective enforcement suddenly found their voices, their frustration boiling over. People were furious. Karen's face was a mask of disbelief. The smug confidence she always carried, the air of entitlement that made her feel untouchable, was gone. She looked around desperately, as if hoping anyone would stand up and defend her, but no one did. Not a single person in that room was willing to save her now. The HOA president, sweating under the pressure, tried to regain control. He slammed his gavel, his voice sharp. We can't just hold a recall vote on impulse. Yes, we can, a voice interrupted. It was Trevor Mitchell, one of the longest-standing residents in the neighborhood. He stood up holding a copy of the HOA bylaws in his hands. According to Section 14, Paragraph 3, if a majority of homeowners vote for a recall in a public meeting, the board is legally required to hold a formal vote within 7 days. The HOA president's face drained of color. Another homeowner, a woman named Margaret, stood up. Then let's make it official. Everyone in favor of removing the current HOA board, raise your hand. Hanson shut up. Karen let out a choked laugh. shaking her head like this was all some big joke. This is absurd. You can't just... More hands went up. People who had once been too afraid to speak out against her and the HOA were finally taking a stand. "All opposed?" Trevor asked. Silence. Not a single hand. Karen's entire world shifted in that moment. Her power gone. The HOA that had always had her back collapsing in real time. The president slumped in his chair, defeated. The vote was undeniable. The board was officially recalled, and an emergency election was scheduled to replace them. The room buzzed with excitement and satisfaction, but Karen was seething. She shot up from her seat, her face twisted with rage. "This is a mistake," she snapped, her voice nearly hysterical. "You think this is going to fix anything? You think you're better off without me? I was the one making sure this neighborhood stayed clean, stayed organized." Trevor folded his arms, his expression unmoved. "No, Karen. You were making sure the rules only applied to everyone else but you." A few people actually laughed, shaking their heads at how pathetic she sounded now. Karen's lips curled in disgust, her hands clenching into fists. "Fine," she spat, turning toward me with a glare so sharp it could cut glass. "This is what you wanted, isn't it? You just couldn't leave it alone. You had to ruin everything." I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, calm, collected, victorious. "Karen, you did that all on your own." She let out a frustrated scream, turning on her heel and storming toward the exit. As she walked past, people muttered under their breaths, shaking their heads, whispering words like pathetic, liar, serves her right. For the first time, Karen wasn't feared, she was ridiculed. And that broke her more than anything else. Over the next few days, the fallout was brutal. With the HOA board dismantled, homeowners began reviewing every shady decision that had been made under Karen's influence. Fees that had been wrongfully collected were refunded. Complaints that had been ignored were finally being addressed. Karen, she was officially banned from holding any HOA-related position ever again. But the worst blow came when her so-called friends, the ones who had benefited from her manipulations, turned their backs on her too. She tried desperately to regain control, to salvage some of the influence she had once wielded. She showed up at community meetings, only to be ignored. She lodged petty complaints, only for the new board to shut them down immediately. And the swim lessons? Dead. No parents wanted their kids around the disgraced former HOA queen. Karen was officially a nobody. And I enjoyed every second of it. But I knew Karen, she wasn't the type to go down quietly. So when I saw the "for sale" sign go up in her yard, I wasn't surprised. She had spent years thinking she owned this neighborhood, thinking she was above everyone else. And now, she was running. But the best part? She couldn't even sell her house for the price she wanted because suddenly property values in the neighborhood weren't what they used to be. Poetic justice. The morning Karen's moving truck finally arrived, the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. People peeked through their curtains, pretending not to watch but failing miserably. After years of her nonsense, no one wanted to miss this. She stood on her front lawn, barking orders at the movers, her face twisted in frustration. It was clear that this wasn't a move by choice, it was a retreat. Her house had sat on the market far longer than she expected, and rumor had it that multiple buyers had backed out after learning about her less than stellar reputation. Even now, her last-minute panic showed she was stressed, snapping at the workers as if somehow this was their fault. Then came the moment that made everything worth it. As one of the movers loaded a box into the truck, the bottom gave out and its contents spilled across the driveway. Among the mess, a brightly colored tacky garden gnome, the same kind she had spent years fining people for having in their yards. The irony was too perfect. A stunned silence followed, then as Karen let out an ear-piercing shriek and lunged for the gnome, someone across the street started clapping. Another neighbor joined in, and before I knew it, the entire block had erupted into cheers and laughter. It was like the final scene of a bad villain being kicked out of town in some over-the-top movie. Karen's face burned red, her lips pressed into a tight, furious line. She snatched the gnome, tossed it into her car, and, without another word, climbed into the driver's seat, slamming the door so hard the windows shook. The tires screeched as she sped off, leaving behind nothing but a cloud of dust and years of resentment. And just like that, she was gone. A collective exhale rippled through the neighborhood. People smiled, shook hands, even high-fived. It wasn't just Karen leaving, it was freedom. The HOA was back under fair management. The ridiculous fines and power trips were over. My pool was finally unquestionably mine. I leaned back in my chair on the porch, lifted my coffee mug, and took a slow, satisfied sip. Victory had never tasted sweeter.